Thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. My name's Paul Quigley. I teach in the history department at Virginia Tech. And another part of my job is to direct the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. And one of my favorite things about the job of director is being able to invite fellow scholars, historians, who are either working currently on amazing, exciting projects or who have recently published interesting books on one topic or another. And in addition to sponsoring these kinds of lectures throughout the year, the center also sponsors academic conferences. We have one coming up next April on slavery during the Civil War. And we also sponsor fellowships for Virginia Tech students. We sponsor visiting researchers to come to Virginia Tech from other organizations and use our special collections. We also have outreach programs in partnership with museums in Virginia, also with local elementary schools. So there's always quite a lot going on at the center. I encourage you to keep up with what we're doing. You can go to our website, civilwar.bt.edu, conveniently just next to my shoulder here. Or of course, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. We should be fairly easy to find, Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. Tonight's speaker, I'm very excited to introduce her to you. She's Dr. Fay Yarbrough, Professor of History and an Associate Dean at Rice University. Dr. Yarbrough is an expert on 19th century Native American history, and she's got a special interest in the interactions between indigenous people and people of African descent during the 19th century. So her first book was Race and the Cherokee Nation, Sovereignty in the 19th Century. And her most recent book is called Choctaw Confederates, the American Civil War in Indian Country. And of course, you recognize the title. That book is the subject of tonight's talk. And it's also basically brand new. I noticed its official publication date was exactly 2 weeks ago. So it's a 2-week birthday for your book this evening. And we're excited to share it with you. You can find it in all of the usual bookstore places, as well as directly from the University of North Carolina Press, the publisher. So the talk will be around 30 to 35 minutes or so. We'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. And the way we do discussion, if you've been to these events before, you'll know we do it all through the Q&A feature in Zoom. So you can type in questions to the Q&A box at any time. So if something occurs to you during the talk, feel free to type it in then or wait till the end, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can. We'll wrap things up within about an hour and 15 minutes, so around 8:15 Eastern time. So that's all from me. I just want to say how grateful I am that Dr. Yarbrough is able to be with us tonight. It's a wonderful book. I've enjoyed reading it. I'm looking forward to hearing the author's perspective on the book as well. Without further ado, I will turn over the virtual podium to Dr. Yarbrough. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, if only virtually. I'd like to thank you for spending some of your time with me this evening, and I'd like to thank Professor Paul Quigley for inviting me. And I'd also like to thank Professor Melinda Miller for a really stimulating, fun chat this afternoon as a prelude to my talk tonight. So I'll share some slides with you in a moment, but first I want to just share the introduction of my paper. Then, just as we starting to leave, here comes something across that little prairie, sure enough. We know they is Indians the way they is riding, and the way they is all strung out. They had a flag, and it was all red and had a big crisscross on it that looked like a sawhorse. The man carrying it and rear back on it when the wind whip it, but it flap all around the horse's head, and the horse pitch and rear like he knows something gonna happen sure. About that time, it turned kind of dark and began to rain a little, and we get out to the big road and the rain come down hard. It rained so hard for a little while that we just have to stop the wagon and sit there. And then come along more soldiers than I ever see before. They all white men, I think, and they have on that brown clothes dyed with walnut and butternut, and old masters say they the Confederate soldiers. Lucinda Davis, enslaved by Tuskaya Heniha, a full-blood Creek Indian, offers one of the few existing accounts of the Battle of Honey Springs in late July of 1863. She describes seeing Native troops approach carrying the Confederate battle flag, the changing weather conditions, and the arrival of white Confederate troops. Her account goes on to explain the roar of gunfire that sounded like horses loping across a plank bridge way off somewhere. Davis offers compelling testimony about the far-reaching and destructive power of battle on the civilian population and on the landscape. But what I am most interested in tonight is the experience of Native soldiers. What do we know of those soldiers on horseback whose riding style was so distinctive that Davis and her fellow spectators identified them as Indians from a distance? What can we say about their experiences in the Confederate Army? To answer these questions, I will turn to the service records from National Archives, compiled service records of Confederate soldiers who served in organizations raised directly by the Confederate government. From the outset, however, these records are something of a misnomer. This title suggests that authorities from the Confederate States of America enlisted these troops into service. However, Choctaw legislative documents from the era reveal that Choctaw lawmakers spent a great deal of time talking about their commitment to the Confederate States of America and raising this force. So here I will share screen so that we can make sure we're all on the same page about where we are in terms of location. So I'm most interested in the Choctaw Nation, which you can see here in this, the southeast corner of Indian Territory at this time. And I focus on the Choctaws because of their strong commitment to the Confederacy, which is what I explore in the larger book project. Here is my moment of shameless self-promotion. Dr. Quigley did some for me, but this talk and more on this subject can be found in my new book, Choctaw Confederates. And the strength of their commitment, which we can talk about in the Q&A, I think is best exemplified by the fact that they pass a statute deeming it treason to say anything negative about the Confederacy, right? That's how strongly they are committed to the Confederate cause. So as a separate sovereign nation with its own constitution, judicial system, and bicameral legislature, Choctaw legislators could choose to align with the federal government or the Confederacy or attempt to remain neutral altogether during the war. They early allied with the Confederacy and agreed to place a regiment of Choctaw troops numbering 1,000 men under Confederate officers, with the Confederacy committing to pay $500,000 to arm and equip said troops. Which authorities, Choctaw or Confederate then, enlisted these troops is less clear than the record's title suggests, which will also be demonstrated by examining the actual enlistment documents, which I'll show you in a moment. In addition, I supplement the service records with firsthand accounts from Civil War soldiers more broadly to create a fuller picture of Choctaw soldiers' experiences. The majority of these enlistment records consist of pre-printed forms compiled by the War Department to facilitate efficiently and rapidly determining individual eligibility for pensions and other veterans' benefits. The records include a jacket with the soldier's name, company, and rank, and lists other cards associated with his record. There were sufficient numbers of Choctaw troops that the pre-printed portion of the jacket or envelope stated 1st Choctaw Mounted Rifles, also known as Cavalry with Confederate in parentheses. The jacket often contains a fill-in-the-blank style company muster roll. The company name and information appear pre-printed on this form as well. The form listed the date, location, and term of enlistment. So here, I'll give you an example of one record from Private Felimi of the 2nd Company K, and you can see on his record that he's listed as age 30, that he enlisted on June 12th, 1861 at Sulphur Spring, Blue County for 12 months. He's enlisted by Iskatini Homa, and you can see that there's info from his company muster roll from July 26, 1862. So these are the records that form the backbone of this talk on military experience for Choctaw soldiers, and is also an important part of the larger book project. And if you see the I just want you to have a little sympathy for me, because I looked through thousands of these records, in this kind of reverse, black background, white writing with the handwriting on there, and compiled them into a database. So especially useful in these records is the remarks section. In most cases, it merely states if an enlistee was present at the end of his term of service, but sometimes it includes rich tidbits about soldiers being absent without leave, about promotions or work duties. A frequently included payroll form stated whether the soldier received a commutation for clothing for 6 months, generally in the amount of $25. Sometimes a bounty pay and receipt roll for $50 is on file as well, along with petitions for official correspondence regarding the soldier. Less frequently, there are other miscellaneous documents, often handwritten, that are included in the soldier's jacket. And I spend a little bit of time giving you this description of these records because there's often this misconception that there aren't a lot of records regarding Native populations that are available, but in fact there are, and we can do a number of things in terms of creative reading of the records that we do have, or looking more deeply to see if there are other records that we might be able to find and combine with other information to create a fuller picture of Native experience. So again, just to remind you of the kinds of information that's in these records available through National. So given our time constraints today, I will touch briefly on some of the info that you can glean from these records. First, the records indicate that more Choctaws served for the Confederacy than we previously knew. Second, the records can give us some sense of changes taking place in Choctaw society. We can also use the records to infer connections between people who served. And in particular, I will look at what the records can tell us about enlistments and how fluctuations in enlistments could vary based on battle and political activity. Most importantly, the records provide a glimpse at the experiences of common soldiers in the Civil War and remind us that the war was not just a rupture between Northern and Southern states, but that other groups, Native groups, were drawn into the dispute. So the contemporary Choctaw Nation estimates that approximately 1,200 Choctaw troops served on the side of the Confederacy by the middle of the Civil War. I've collected the service records of over 3,100 individuals for the totality of the war. And these 3,100 troops translate to roughly 17.2% of the total population, or 20% of the Choctaw population if you exclude enslaved persons. In the United States, soldiers accounted for approximately 14% of the Northern population and 8.3% of the Confederacy and border states. If one excludes the enslaved population of the South, however, 12.5 Southerners served in the Confederacy. So I point this out to say that while that 3,100 Choctaw soldiers might seem like a small number, as a proportion of the population, it's actually quite large and substantial. So this figure, though, of 3,100 troops is much lower than the 10,000 troops that Colonel Douglas H. Cooper predicted that the Choctaws and Chickasaws would provide in a letter to the president of the Confederacy, Jeff Davis, a number all the more astonishing given the combined population of the Choctaw and Chickasaw populations at this time was less than 23,000 people, including their enslaved populations. Cooper wrote, "The Choctaws and Chickasaws can furnish 10,000 warriors if needed. The Choctaws and Chickasaws are extremely anxious to form another regiment." The data included in the compiled military service records tell us not only about individual soldiers, but can reveal aspects of the changing nature of Choctaw society. So for instance, the names on these records can simultaneously demonstrate the influence of Euro-Americans and the resilience of traditional naming practices. So here is an example of some of the names that we can see on in these records. So you'll see names such as John Simpson, several Thomas Jeffersons, a Jefferson Davis, a private H-25, but also more traditional names like Cubby or Ihan Tubby or Hio Kanubi. You see these blended names, right, where there's a European root of a name, but then combined with a Choctaw language name. And then you also see surnames of prominent families within the Choctaw political arena. So the Folsoms, LaFleurs, and McCurtains are important families that produced district or principal chiefs in the Choctaw Nation during the 19th century. So again, something as simple as these names on these enlistment records can reveal broader changes that were taking place in Choctaw society. The age data on soldiers from the first Choctaw and Chickasaw mounted rifles also provide some opportunity for comparison with similar data on American soldiers. And I'll just summarize to say that Choctaw soldiers, the average age of enlistees was just a little bit older than the average age of enlistees in the Union Army. And then based on what little data we have on Confederate soldiers that Jim McPherson has compiled, again, we can see that they're slightly older than their American counterparts. The age plus name data can also reveal relationships between soldiers, or it suggests relationships between soldiers. So there's a cluster of 5 Greenwood enlistees aged 20 to 28. We wonder if Allen, Gibson, Harris, Hogan, and Sesson Greenwood, who all mustered into the same company, 1E, on the same day, July 3rd, 1861, at the same location at Black Jack Court Ground, were all related to each other. Were they brothers or cousins who enlisted together? Similarly, Joseph Hunter, aged 43, and Stylen Hunter, aged 18, both joined May Tubby's company at Goodland Station on September 2nd, 1864. Could they have been a father and son in hopes joining together in hopes of watching out for one another? These sources are maddeningly silent about such connections, but other data from the Indian Pioneer History Collection, which is very similar to the WPA slave narratives, but the informants in the Indian Pioneer History Collection are people who lived in Indian Territory during the 19th century. That data, along with personal papers, can augment some of these military records to confirm relationships. And we know for certain that in both the Union and the Confederate armies, family members did join together, cousins, brothers, fathers, and sons. So we shouldn't be surprised that we see similar kinds of patterns in these records in the Choctaw Nation. So another kind of record that seems, another piece of data that seems fairly straightforward is the question of company assignment, right? So individuals mustered into Company A or to the 2nd K or the 2nd D. But as was common among many other Confederate troops, Choctaw companies were also known by names connected to their commanding officers. So Captain Sinta Nawa's company, for example, was also known as Walking Snake Company, but also known as Company I. We have other companies, Captain Coleman E. Nelson's company, or Captain Edmund Gardner's company, or Captain Shimonta, in parentheses, John Gibson's company. These company names were pre-printed on these enlistment records. So again, reinforcing how frequently they occur and that people knew these companies by these other names. And the use of, I think of Choctaw language and English names is also noteworthy. So Sinti is snake in Choctaw, and Noah means walk. So that Walking Snake and Captain Sinta Noe's name, Walking Snake Company and Sinta Noah's company, is a translation of his name. And so I think it's interesting to ponder that the traditional Choctaw language name was included. Similarly, Shimonta may come from the Choctaw word Shima, which means to dress up or embellish. And so perhaps this John Gibson, also known as Captain Shimonta's company, is again a recognition of a traditional Choctaw name. So again, the presence of these Choctaw traditional names on these Civil War military records exemplifies how much this quintessentially American event included other people who did not identify as Americans. The date on on these records, the date and place of muster record reveals patterns about when and where soldiers enlisted into this mounted rifle group. Almost 70% of the records include this information, which only makes sense if you think about trying to keep track of how long people's enlistment period is supposed to last. You definitely want to keep track of when and where they enlisted so that you know when their term of service should end. So we can see in these records that the majority of the enlistments took place in 1861. June and July were especially popular months to enlist. 950 soldiers enlisted in these 2 months alone. And this Choctaw enthusiasm for the Confederacy is even more remarkable given that the Choctaws did not sign a treaty with the Confederacy until July of 1861. So there are Choctaw men who are committing to fight in the war even before the Choctaw legislature had officially sided with the Confederacy. So again, the enthusiasm is high. Historian Angie Debo notes that the work of consolidating Indian support began before any formal treaties were signed between the Choctaw Indians and the Confederate government. The Choctaw government had already passed a resolution in support of the Southern states in February of 1861, though the formal treaty alliance would not come for 5 more months. So perhaps getting these men to enlist wasn't a difficult task. Surely the Choctaw resolution was in response to the February 4th meeting of 6 Southern states in Montgomery to form a provisional government and establish the Confederate States of America. So that resolution of support must have been in response to this meeting. The Choctaws may have been waiting for the seceding states to create a more formal body before expressing Choctaw support. U.S. Indian agent Douglas H. Cooper enrolled natives for service as early as April of 1861, again before an official treaty of alliance had been signed. Muster rolls show over 100 troops enlisted in May of 1861, specifically on May 13th in Scullyville, described, which you can see here in the northeast corner of Choctaw Nation. And Scullyville was known as a particular stronghold for Southern support because of the large number of slaveholders in the area. So perhaps that explains this high number of enlistments in that area. Or this fervor for enlistment might have been prompted by the neighboring state of Arkansas's decision to join the Confederacy less than 1 week prior on May 7th of 1861. So you can see other locations on this map that were hotbeds of enlistment activity: Dokesville, Fort Washita, Fort Arbuckle, Sulphur Spring, Goodland Station, Sugarloaf, Boggy Depot, Blackjack Grove, and Perryville were all locations for clusters of enlistment in 1861. Dokesville and Boggy Depot each served as capitals of the Choctaw Nation, so these seem like very logical sites for forming companies. In 1862, enthusiasm for the war among Choctaw Indians was still strong. Nearly 800 men enlisted in the regiment during the second year of the war. January, March, and July were especially popular times. The almost 200 men who joined the regiment in January may have been spurred to action by the November and December battles that took place in Indian Territory: Round Mountain, Chustotalasa, and Chustenala. All 3 engagements were efforts to subdue wealthy Creek Indian Apothle Yahola and his followers. Initially hoping to remain neutral, the Creek leader disagreed with the Creek Council's decision to ally with the Confederacy. While other Native nations were negotiating treaties of alliance with Confederate officials, Indians loyal to the American federal government were coalescing around Apothle Yahola, who we can see in this rendering here. Though his wife was a slaveholder, he promised freedom for enslaved people, and many in nearby Indian nations ran away to join him. Phoebe Banks, whose parents had been owned by the Creek Perriman and McIntosh families, recalled her family joining Gage, as Apothle Yahola was known. All our family joined up with him, and there was lots of Creek Indians and slaves in the outfit when they made a break for the north. The runaways was riding ponies stolen from their masters, she says. Moreover, many free Blacks also favored his unionist stance and joined the loyal Creek camps, which were growing in size. Some estimated that Opothle Yahola had as many as 9,000 followers, though only 2,000 would have been fighting men. Colonel Douglas H. Cooper led over 1,400 Native Confederates, supplemented by the 9th Texas Cavalry, to attack and then pursue Chief Opothle Yahola and his band. Each of these 3 battles punctuated Opothle Yahola's flight to Kansas. There were a number of deaths that were recorded in these records, 105, 4 of which were for horses, which is something we can talk about in the Q&A if you would like. 7 were from this campaign against Opothle Yahola. Cherokee Presbyterian minister Stephen Foreman wrote in his diary in January of 1862 that he had heard about 14 men were lost in the fighting. Perhaps the additional deaths noted by Foreman came from the 9th, 4th Texas Cavalry that Colonel Cooper had called in as reinforcements. Despite these losses, the Confederate forces could claim a victory because they had forced so many loyal Indians into Kansas and neutralized the threat represented by Opothle Yahola. But would this threat remain outside of Indian territory? Missionary Joseph Morrow worried that once the weather conditions improved, there will be squally times in this territory again, unless there is a considerable force of Confederate troops on the Kansas border to oppose Old Posey, another nickname for Opothle Yahola, and his wild Indians and wilder Jayhawkers. If this feeling was widespread within Indian territory more broadly and among the Choctaws in particular, it may explain the burst of enlistments in January of 1862. The men joined the regiment at Eagletown, Lukfatka, and Dokesville, all located in the Apookshanoopi district in the southeastern corner of the nation, closer to Texas and Arkansas. Nearly 230 more men enlisted in March, again from this same area. The companies raised in Red River County formed on March 10th, most likely in response to the battle at Pea Ridge, which was at Elkhorn Tavern in nearby Arkansas. Right, so here's one representation of the battle at Pea Ridge from 1889, so after the war, but still in the 19th century. And here is a 20th century rendering, again, which we could talk about if you like. That comes from the Topps Trading Card Company. And this was produced in 1962 as a part of a celebration of the war centennial. And it's the art of Bob Saunders. And the back of the card had a summary of the war. And the whole collection included 88 cards, 87 with images, and then a card that was the checklist so that you knew you had collected all the cards. And right, you can see the difference in terms of the depiction in the 19th century versus the depiction in the 20th century. So I'm gonna pause share because I don't want to leave us on this. And well, I'll go forward to battles so you can see battles that are taking place. So the first Choctaw and Chickasaw mounted rifles failed to arrive on time at Pea Ridge, and the federal forces defeated the Confederate troops. The Confederate General Albert Pike pulled back his forces, leaving Indian Territory very isolated. The proximity of the fighting and the threat of Southern failure may have spurred Confederate Choctaw companies to form. June and July brought still another 200 troops into service. So I hope what I'm giving you a sense of, what I'm trying to argue for, is that you can see that these battles can spur enlistment activity, that the enlistments are happening obviously in this larger world where they're paying attention to events, they're paying attention to political activity, they're paying attention to battles, and this can encourage or discourage enlistments among Choctaw troops. So because I want to be mindful of our time, and I always have more stuff than I should. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Just to mention the Tonkawa massacre, which takes place in the least district of the Chickasaw Nation. You can see the star marking that. And I want to bring this up just because it demonstrates that during the war, there can be tensions within groups, and there can be tensions between Native groups that are magnified by what's happening with the war. So the Wichita Agency is in the least district, and it's at the center of the action. The Wichita Indians claimed that their treaty with the Confederacy had been signed under duress, but groups such as the Comanches and Tonkawas had signed willingly. The Confederate government was not able to meet the stipulations for supplies and medicine included in the treaty. As Texans continued to make incursions at the agency, despite their shared loyalty to the Confederacy, tensions rose to the point that Indian agent Matthew Leeper moved his family to the safety of Sherman, Texas. When Union raiders, which reportedly included members of the Shawnee, Delaware, Kickapoo, Seminole, Cherokee, and Osage tribes, infiltrated the agency, some Confederate Indians joined the raiders because of their frustrations with Leeper and the Confederate government's unkept promises. Reports of the death of a Caddo boy and the suspected cannibalism of the Tonkawas suddenly focused the various groups' ire sharply on the Tonkawas. The Tonkawas reported to Superintendent S.S. Scott that they lost 23 of their warriors and about 100 of their women and children in the massacre. The American Civil War then could exacerbate tensions within Native groups and between Native groups, in some ways echoing the notion of the war as a fight that could pit brother against brother or friend against friend. Rather than stoke enthusiasm for the Confederacy, the Tonkawa massacre revealed how convoluted the alliances between groups could be and the persistence of old grievances. By 1863, we see that the enlistment numbers declined sharply, only 189 soldiers enlisted. Remember, we chart more than 1,000 enlistments in 1861 and nearly 800 in 1862. As in the larger Confederacy, by 1863, the Civil War had gone on much longer than anyone expected. The realities of fighting, familial separation, and being poorly provisioned extinguished Choctaw enthusiasm for the war. As Confederate officer Edward W. Cade wrote to his wife in 1863, "I am sick of war and the separation from the dearest objects of life." Surely many Choctaw soldiers would have agreed with this sentiment. Captain David Perkins, for instance, resigned his command of Company E in the 1st Choctaw and Chickasaw Regiment in 1863 because of physical infirmity, but also stated, "And last but not least, the reason is I have so many little children. Unless I stay at home and provide for them, they must necessarily suffer, as they have been during my first campaign." These men felt the tug of family and home and knew the suffering of the civilians as the war continued. The Choctaw enlistments that did occur clustered in the first half of 1863 in February, March, and April, with no enlistments occurring after July. Of course, in January of 1863, we have the Emancipation Proclamation from Abraham Lincoln, which took effect, ending slavery in rebelling states and parts of states. While it was unclear if the proclamation applied to Indian Territory, news of emancipation did spread to Indian Territory. If nothing else, Union troops sometimes informed enslaved people in Indian Territory of their change in status. So this woman, Charlotte Johnson White, learned of emancipation when soldiers arrived at her Cherokee master's plantation. Perhaps more relevant to Choctaw military enlistments was the activity in the Cherokee Nation in the first part of 1863. A pro-Union faction of Cherokees claimed rightful authority to govern and established a new legislature in February of 1863, and one of their first acts was to abolish slavery in the Cherokee Nation. While many Cherokee slaveholders did not recognize the legitimacy of this new government and likely ignored this act, the fact remains that these actions brought abolition and the prospect of emancipation to the heart of Indian Territory. For some Choctaws, events in the Cherokee Nation may have hardened their resolve and led to the clusters of enlistments in Scullyville and San Boys, locations in Moshelatubbee district closer to the Cherokee Nation. On the other hand, perhaps Cherokee emancipation and Lincoln's proclamation led many other Choctaws to see the Confederate chances for success declining and affected the overall, softened the overall enlistment numbers. In July, battles took place at Cabin Creek and Honey Springs, right, which you can see the Choctaw Nation map here, and that some of the enlistments have been taking place. And if we go to the battle, right, here we go. You can see the battles at Cabin Creek and Honey Springs. These also may have affected Choctaw enlistment numbers. Cabin Creek was located along Texas Road, an important supply route for moving military supplies from Fort Scott, Kansas to Indian Territory. And the battle consisted of a series of skirmishes as Stan Wade's forces attempted to capture federal supplies. The Confederates eventually failed, and Wade blamed the defeat on his lack of cannon. More remarkable is the diversity of forces present. Troops from Colorado, Wisconsin, and Kansas, the Indian Home Guards, Confederate Indian troops, Texas partisans, and the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers all clashed on the battlefield. Private Christopher Kimball of the 9th Kansas Cavalry described the federal forces attempting the crossing. Major Foreman assumed command, which consisted of the Indians, 5 companies of the Colored Regiment, the Mounted Men of the 2nd Colorado, and Captain Charles J. Stewart's company, the 9th Kansas. Major Foreman, followed by Captain Bud Gritz of the 3rd Indian, advanced into the stream. It's amazing the confluence of troops that participated in this battle. Private Kimball's words paint a portrait of men of different races fighting together to preserve the country. In fact, historian Mark Louse suggests that the Union's triracial army in the West could have been a model for future race relations in the United States. Here you can see a very pixelated version of the Confederate battle flag based on the seal of the Choctaw Nation. Note the bow and arrow as well as the tomahawk at the center. Like Cabin Creek, Honey Springs was also located along the important supply route of the Texas Road. And in July of 1863, Confederate forces used the location as a staging ground to prepare an attack on Fort Gibson and push federal forces out of Indian Territory. Soldiers amassed at Honey Springs. Here's a sketch of it from Harper's Weekly, and brought in supplies in preparation for the march to Fort Gibson. Again, the fighting would include men of Native ancestry, of African ancestry, and Euro-Americans, a fact not lost on the men involved. As they waited for the command to advance, Colonel James M. Williams told the men of the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers, "This is the day we have been patiently waiting for. The enemy at Cabin Creek gave you the opportunity of showing them what men can do fighting for their natural rights and for their recently acquired freedom and the freedom of their children and their children's children." Colonel Williams also assessed his men's performance after the fighting. They, the rebels, received a lesson which, in my opinion, taught them not to despise on the battlefield a race they had long tyrannized over as having no rights which a white man was bound to respect. I had long been of the opinion that this race had a right to kill traitors, and they proved their capacity for the work. Colonel Williams certainly understood the meaning of colored troops on this battlefield for themselves and for the men that they faced. Private Edward Folsom of the 1st Choctaw and Chickasaw Mounted Rifles was on the other side of the battle lines, and the colored troops made an impression on him as well. He remarked, "It was not long before the federal cavalry found us and came over with Negro troops and give us fight. We had one side of Elk Creek and they the other. It was a stand-up fight. I never did see so many wounded Negro troops in a small fight." Soldiers everywhere, not just in the South, were impressed by the combat action of colored troops during the war. The Confederates failed at Honey Springs because of inferior munitions supplies, and in part, the combined actions of the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment and the Indian Home Guards. The Confederates outnumbered the Federals by 2-1, but were outgunned 3-1. And the inferior quality of the Confederate gunpowder meant that the downpour during the battle on July 17th rendered their arms useless, according to General Cooper. As the fight raged on, the Federal Indian Home Guard Regiment inadvertently misled the 20th and 29th Texas Cavalry into thinking that the Federals were retreating, and the Texans pursued only to be met with a volley of bullets from the 1st Kansas Colored and forced to pull back. Then the Federal troops picked up the Texans' colors. Tandy Walker arrived with Choctaw and Chickasaw troops late in the fight and was able to hold the Federal forces as the Confederate forces continued to retreat. Dallas Bowman, a private from the 1st Choctaw and Chickasaw Mounted Rifles, remembered, "The Feds followed us about half a mile out on the prairie, at which time our battalion charged on them and held them in check until the train could get out of the way." Native troops then were important to both Confederate and Federal forces in the battle. As the troops fled, General Cooper ordered the destruction of supplies and munitions located in Honey Springs. Corporal W.K. Macomson of the Confederate Indian Brigade led the squad that set fire to the commissary and quartermaster stores. Formerly enslaved person Henry Clay had been owned in Creek Nation and remembered the smoke and fire as the Yankees burn up Honey Springs, he said. But in reality, what he likely saw was the results of Confederate action rather than Federal action. Some enslaved people also witnessed the battle and described the fighting and retreat years later. Creek freedwoman Lucinda Davis, from this lecture's opening, heard the guns going all day, and along in the evening, here come the South Side making for a getaway. They come riding and running by where we is, and it don't make no difference how much the headman hollers at them. They can't make that bunch slow up and stop. Davis's description matches Private Bowman's comments that Confederate troops scattered, which caused confusion, and we had a general stampede. Likewise, Private Edward Folsom reported that his company's picket stampeded and broke for the mountains and almost got away. Phoebe Banks's uncle Jacob told her the fighting at Honey Creek was the most terrible fighting he's seen, but the Union soldiers whipped and went back into Fort Gibson. The rebels was chased all over the country and couldn't find each other for a long time, the way he tell it. Banks's family had been owned by a Creek family and followed Opothleyahula to Kansas. Uncle Jacob had returned to Indian territory with Federal troops to fight the Indians that stayed with the South, in his words. A disheartened Private R. McDermott from the 20th Texas Cavalry seemed to confirm Uncle Jacob's account. "I believe they will whip us and whip us all the time until we are reinforced from Texas at some other point. We got so much scatteredness in the stampede that we was 3 days getting together and not all have come in yet." It seems that Confederate soldiers truly had scattered across the country and did not regroup immediately for a counterattack or another engagement. So this battle at Honey Springs proved to be the largest battle fought in Indian Territory based on numbers. Approximately 9,000 men met here, and nearly 6,000 were approximately 9,000, close to 6,000 Confederates and close to 4,000 Union soldiers. The Confederate loss left the Texas road open for Union control and allowed Federal troops to take Fort Gibson. Some view Honey Springs as a turning point for Confederate forces in Indian Territory, after which white troops no longer defended the area in an organized manner. Moreover, the victory gave Federal troops an avenue into Choctaw Nation, described as the fiercest and most steadfast of the Indian nations in the Confederacy. Given the scale of the fighting and the defeat, it comes as no surprise that the 1st Choctaw and Chickasaw Mounted Rifles did not see any new enlistments for the remainder of the year. The Federals sent troops to Fort Gibson to strengthen their position in the territory, and July of 1863 handed Confederate forces major losses. Confederates were back on their heels, and Choctaw soldiers may have viewed the Southern effort as a losing one overall. So the compiled service records for the soldiers of the 1st Choctaw and Chickasaw Mounted Rifles provide a window into the experiences of Civil War soldiers in Indian Territory. The troops often did not leave other kinds of records such as journals or diaries, and letters home were rare indeed. Service records include important information about when and where soldiers mustered for battle, for how long they enlisted, and the kind of work they performed. The accompanying records in the service jackets, while uneven and unpredictable, offer further glimpses of daily life for the troops. Some of the records that I haven't discussed today tracked the movement of federal prisoners of war from camp to camp and showed that some soldiers would choose to swear the oath of loyalty and even join federal units. Other prisoners of war were exchanged. These records also included more mundane, though consequential information, such as petitions for promotion, letters of resignation, and certificates of disability. The records offer the opportunity to add meat to bare bones data about troop movements and battle losses. Thus, a picture emerges of enthusiastic enlistees in the Choctaw Nation at the beginning of the war, whose support for the war waned as they were plagued by poor provisions and desertion as the war progressed. Choctaw Confederates then were not so different from Southern Confederates in many respects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great. Really enjoyed it. We've already got some good questions coming in, and I'd like to encourage the audience to keep those questions coming, type them into the Q&A box. We've got a couple of questions that both touch on the motivations for Choctaw people to side with the Confederacy. And both people asking this question kind of assume, based partly on what you've said and partly on other knowledge, I think, that it was one of those cases where they joined with the Confederacy because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they obviously had a very strained history with the United States. One of the people asking this kind of question draws a parallel with the American Revolution, where some Native Americans sided with one side or the other because of the way they'd been treated in the past. So what would you say about the primary motivation of the Choctaws for siding with the Confederacy?
I think the Choctaws were interested in a couple of things. One, they were interested in protecting their sovereignty and preserving their identity as Choctaw people. And I think I sometimes make the joke that, although I don't know if everyone will like this joke, but I sometimes make the joke that for the Choctaws, the argument about states' rights actually had real meaning that the Choctaws understood this as a moment that they could protect sovereignty. Surely people who are claiming to want to have states' rights would recognize the sovereignty of these native nations, right? And moreover, the Confederate government promises them all kinds of things. They promise to recognize sovereignty. They promise to pay for all of their costs related to the war. They offer them representation in the Confederate Congress, right? So I think one layer of it is that they're attempting to preserve Choctaw sovereignty. Another level of their support for the Confederacy has to do with their participation in the enslavement of people of African descent. They're slaveholders. They have an economy in which slavery is an important part. They're producing cotton for the market. Now, their mix of goods they're producing is a little bit different. They produce more corn than cotton, which isn't what you see in the larger South, but they are using slave labor, and they are creating a society that has a racial hierarchy. And so I think that is another reason why they support the Confederacy. They have all these connections and ties to the South as well. The Indian agents that the federal government have sent to work with Native nations are by and large from the South, right? So they're going to have this relationship and be proposing that the Native nations should support Southern causes. They are the funds that are due to the Choctaw Nation. A lot of them are invested in Southern companies and Southern concerns, right? So there is also an element of thinking, well, if we don't side with the South, are we going to lose all of these investments that have been made on our behalf, right? So there are a lot of factors that push them in that direction. But I argue that paramount is this concern for sovereignty and this desire to protect Choctaw sovereignty, which is connected to a desire to preserve Choctaw identity. And then the fact that they're practicing the enslavement of people of African descent, and the Confederacy promises to protect that, right? So, that's an important factor in their decision.
Yeah, definitely. And would you say the Confederates genuinely saw the Choctaws as equals in this kind of racial hierarchy? Saw them as fellow slaveholders who had that common interest, or was it more an alliance of convenience for the Confederacy?
I would go with the latter, an alliance of convenience. And I say that because there are these moments where they're coming to, the Confederacy goes to the Native Nations because they see the Indian Territory as an important place, that they don't want them to side with the federal government because, it's making an inroad into a place where federal troops could easily attack southern states, right? So there's that's motivating Confederate desire to have Native nations as allies. But there are these, and they recognize that they're slaveholders and trade with them, et cetera. But then there are these moments in the treaty agreement that they make with the Choctaws and Chickasaws, for instance, where the Confederate government asserts authority in a way that reveals that they don't respect their sovereignty. So for instance, when they make the offer of, you could have someone be a delegate in our government, they then want to supervise the election. Well, why does the Confederate government need to supervise the election in Chickasaw Nation or Choctaw Nation of their delegate? They've been conducting elections for quite some time and they seem to know what they're doing. So, right. So it's, moments like that, or where they make stipulations in the alliance that if the Choctaws sell land or make any land cession agreements with the federal government, then they forfeit all of the land, right? Well, that's the kind of requirement you make when you see yourself as being in some position of authority over that population. And then you have these statements from Confederate soldiers where they talk about Native troops and in pretty racist terms, in the language that seems very familiar if you look at how white soldiers talk about colored troops, right? Lack of discipline, don't take care of their uniforms, right? The same kind of language. So I think there's definitely, they're not seeing them as equals.
Yeah. Yeah. A different kind of question now, more on the kind of military side of things. You told us about a few battles close to what was then Indian Territory or within Indian Territory that Choctaw soldiers fought in. Did they fight in any battles further east?
The Native Nations make a requirement of their alliance with the Confederacy that they can't be asked to fight outside of Indian Territory without their permission, right? So they feel very committed to staying in Indian Territory unless they agree to do it. So the example that usually comes out is it's Poison Springs or Fort Pillow. It's where there's a massacre of colored troops, and it's Choctaw troops that are described as being vicious in their So they can go outside of Indian Territory, and but not on the eastern. They're not going to go on the eastern seaboard unless I'm sure there may be examples of, for instance, maybe scouts that are right, because we know that there are scouts like Seneca scouts or whatever that are in other areas, but I haven't seen evidence of them going all the way to the eastern seaboard. And again, they are quite clear that they have to agree if they're going to go somewhere outside of Indian Territory.
Right. We have a couple of questions about slavery and the Choctaw people. Just kind of generally, what was slavery like in the Choctaw Nation? And another question about whether either the Choctaw or the Chickasaw made any kind of official statement about slavery or the enslaved people. I assume that means their role in the Civil War and, you know, their place as the place of slavery as a motivation for Choctaw or Chickasaw involvement.
So in terms of what slavery looked like in Choctaw Nation, there's a whole chapter in my book. For Chickasaw Nation, you can see Barbara Krauthamer's excellent book. But in general, it looks a lot like what you think of as slavery in the American South. So again, the mix of crop production can be a little bit different, but there are Choctaw slaveholders who are large slaveholders who are producing cotton for market. There are examples of abroad marriages, meaning marriages where the enslaved partners don't live on the same plantation. We see evidence of that in Choctaw Nation. I would say something that's a little bit different is that in Choctaw Nation and in Indian Territory, you see examples of sometimes enslaved people serving as interpreters, because sometimes you have enslaved people who actually may have been enslaved in a place like Georgia or Alabama or something and speak English, but then now are versed in the Choctaw language. And so you have that happen sometimes where there are enslaved people who are serving as interpreters in the Choctaw Nation. So I think that probably would come as a surprise to people. But in many ways, the contours are very similar, again, to the larger American South. There are some accounts that you see where enslaved people in their autobiographies later, their narratives later, will say that Native masters are kinder. But we also have accounts of Native masters being quite cruel. So I think there's a spectrum of treatment, just like in the larger American South, that there's a spectrum of treatment of enslaved people by masters that varies based on the master, not so much because they're in a Native nation. If you take the accounts of some white Southerners who describe what's happening in Choctaw Nation and in Indian Territory, they will often say things which I think we can assume are tinged by racism. So Native masters are lazy and they don't know how to control their slaves, or they don't know how to do work, or they don't get it. They're not good masters, like effective masters. And I don't know if we really have evidence of that, or if that's just, the rhetoric that those people are using because they're trying to say something negative about Native masters. So that's a little bit of a snapshot. And I've lost the thread of the second half of the question.
Yeah, it was there any kind of official statement where the Choctaw, the Chickasaw came out and said, we're doing this because of slavery, or, slavery means this to us?
Oh, in that kind of way. Let me think. There are statements where the principal chief or other Choctaw officials will things like, we're Southern in every respect, where they say things like that, we're Southern in every respect, or where they talk about the purchase and sale of enslaved people, or there's a letter from a prominent Choctaw where he talks about why Lincoln is a problem, right? And that they're not for emancipation, or letters where they say kind of the same thing that you see white slaveholders say, like, say howdy to my people for me, meaning they're enslaved people. So it's very similar in terms of the way that they're talking about it. Now, do we have an Alexander Stevens cornerstone moment? No, we do not have a cornerstone moment of this new nation is built upon this. No, we don't have that, or not that I've found yet.
Right. So one of the things I really liked about your book is the way you talk about the sources you used. And that came out in the talk tonight with the compiled service records, and you showed us examples. In the book itself, you also talk a fair amount about the WPA slave narratives and how you approach those, and I think you have some very thoughtful and interesting things to say there. So I wonder if you could share a bit of that with the audience tonight, what those sources are like, how you use them, what kinds of cautions you have to take in using those sources.
Yeah, so if folks aren't familiar with them, the Works Progress Administration slave narratives, the WPA slave narratives, are an amazing resource. I think at this point there's 50 volumes. They're organized by state, but that's a little bit misleading because they're like the Texas narratives are people who were interviewed in Texas, not necessarily who had been enslaved in Texas, right? So these narratives develop because during the Great Depression, when they're putting people to work, they're also putting writers to work to collect these narratives. And the work really starts with Black academics who send their students out from historically Black colleges to go out and interview formerly enslaved people, because they realize that it's, they're getting older. It's, 60 years after emancipation, and that this is a valuable resource that's fading away. And so these Black academics do some of this early interviewing of people, and then the Works Progress Administration kind of takes up the mantle of that and puts writers to work and have them go out and interview formerly enslaved people. And they ask about all kinds of stuff, food, punishment, relationships, church, religious practices. And there's a similar thing that happens with the Indian pioneer histories, but again, they're interviewing people who were in Indian territory in the 19th century. And the WPA slave narratives, you have to be very careful in how you work with them. So one, some states are overrepresented, like Arkansas, right? There are too many narratives in Arkansas for the distribution of the enslaved population. They're obviously going to skew towards people who were very young at the time of emancipation because it's so many years after, right? Another complaint is that people's memory might not be so good, right? That many years after. There's a great article in the Journal of Southern History that's about how maybe these narratives tell you more about the moment of the Great Depression than they do about the past, because there's a lot of descriptions of food in those narratives. And if you think about people who are starving because of the Depression, you could imagine a lot of discussion of good food that you had in the past. But other problems include that some of the interviewers, right, some of the people sent out to interview these formerly enslaved people are related to the people who enslaved the person being interviewed, right? So that's awkward. We see a difference in terms of, for instance, how the informants talk about punishment if the interviewer is white or if the interviewer is Black, right? There are also some things that you have to think about in terms of how the interviewer is rendering the person's voice. So there are these narratives where the interviewer asks the question, the informant responds, and where the interviewer, and includes this in the transcription, which I always find kind of amazing. Auntie, is this how you talk when you're with your own people? I want you to talk to me the way that you would talk to your own people. So you'll have this first part that's in standard English. Then once the person has asked the informant, well, I want you to talk to me the way you talk to your own people, everything else is in dialect. But then you wonder, is it in dialect because the person actually spoke to you in dialect, or did you decide they should be speaking in dialect, right? So I'm giving you all these reasons why we have to be careful or a little bit skeptical of these sources. However, if you use them carefully, if you think about, well, like another transcription problem, I don't know how old I am. It'll say, I don't know how old I am. But the person will write it as, I don't know, N-O, how old I am, instead of I don't know, K-N-O-W, how old I am. Well, how do you know that your informant doesn't know the difference between no, N-O, and no, K-N-O-W, right? So again, these kinds of concerns. But I think if you read them carefully and then compare them to other kinds of material that we have, look for patterns within the narratives where you see a common thing mentioned by many informants over geography, right? That then you can make some good suppositions about how accurate they are. And the last thing that I would say about them is that two things I would say about them. One, they're held up to a kind of scrutiny that sometimes it seems that other sources not about Black people are not held up to, right? And we should be asking these kinds of questions of all of the sources that we look at. Why is it that these sources in particular have to be so concerning for people? So that's one. And number two is that they're this amazing opportunity to hear from enslaved people in their own voice, as much as we can see that it's their own voice, right? That it's so unique that we have we have this way to access some of their thoughts and feelings for, a population that legally was prohibited from gaining literacy so that they could record this themselves at the time. So I think they're really valuable and really powerful. And then also they sometimes include photos, so you can actually see the person being interviewed, which again, I think it's amazing. And I tell my students in class all the time, slavery is not as far away from the present moment as we think, right? I mean, these are people from the 20th century who were alive and experienced enslavement, right? That it's not a distant past. It's much closer than perhaps uncomfortably close to us in time.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Maybe we can move on to the post-war period just for the last few minutes, which you also get into in your book. And one of the questions is about relations with the US government and sort of attitudes towards the Confederate government after the war, after the Confederacy was defeated. I guess one way to ask it would be, did the Choctaws regret what they had done, and did they suffer for what they had done in their relations with the US government after the war?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because you get a kind of rewriting of what happened later. So I gave all these examples of, wow, they're enlisting before the Treaty of Alliance has even been signed. They are thronging these locations in order to sign up, to muster in for service. What you get after the war is you get statements from the principal chief that say things like, we had no other choice. We were forced into this position. We would have chosen something else if we could have, right? So you definitely get a rewriting and a minimization of that enthusiasm and desire to enlist that we see if we look at these records. So that definitely happens. The second thing that we do see is that, yes, it definitely affects the relationship between Native nations and the federal government. They get reconstructed just like the larger South does. And so there's, a treaty that forces them to accept formerly enslaved people that they owned, right? So they don't have to take formerly enslaved people from Texas, say, right? They have to accept them as citizens. Mm-hmm. And because land is held in common, this gives those freed people land. And that's a huge difference, obviously, than what happens in the larger South, right? So for the freedmen, it's a very different picture because they're in Choctaw Nation or Chickasaw Nation versus in Georgia or Alabama, et cetera. They get access to land. Now, do they get access to the same amount of land as other people as citizens by blood? No, but they still get access to land, and that has real consequences, which Melinda Miller could tell people all about, right? So there's that consequence for the freed people, but the larger consequence is that the federal government can use the participation of the Choctaws and the Chickasaws and the Cherokees on the side of the Confederacy to make more inroads on Native sovereignty, to be punitive in ways that then allow them to get access to more land and to chip away at Native sovereignty and Native self-government. So there are definite consequences, definite bad consequences for having made that decision.
Right. And you mentioned, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee has been in some ways in a similar boat and situation. One attendee is asking about the comparison between the way those three nations treated formerly enslaved Black people after the war. You mentioned in the Choctaw case that they were required to give Black people citizenship of a kind, but maybe not full citizenship. And was that the same in all three nations, or was it different?
Well, so I should first say that initially, when the federal government makes this demand, they say, or the people, the freed people will have to leave. And the Choctaw Nation says, yes, make them go. So their initial response is, no, we don't want to make them citizens, and you should. And the federal government withholds money, waiting for the Choctaws to comply and make citizens of these folks. Then the federal government gives them the money. And so then the Choctaw government says, well, yeah, we still want them gone. You gave us the money. We told you we didn't want them here. So the freed people actually exist in a weird kind of legal limbo in Choctaw Nation until 1883, until they pass a bill to clarify their status. Cherokee Nation, since that's the subject of my first book, they do things like put in the newspaper that freed people have to get back to Cherokee Nation in a time limit if they want to be eligible for citizenship, which is tough because some Cherokee enslavers actually did what many other Southerners do and refugee elsewhere, and took their enslaved property to Texas. And so, it's hard for a largely illiterate population. You put an ad in the newspaper that says, hurry back if you want to be eligible for citizenship, right? That's tough. So the Cherokee Nation does that, and they like the Choctaw Nation, are forced to grant citizenship, but then do all kinds of things to limit your political rights. Right. So the freed people are able to be citizens and to access land, but there are other kinds of limitations placed on their political rights and civil rights.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I'm afraid to say we're actually out of time. I really, really enjoyed our conversation. I want to thank the audience for providing us with great questions. I apologize if we didn't get to your question. but I really appreciate them all. And I also want to say I appreciate the sentiments of the people who simply say, you know, this was a great talk, thank you very much. And that kind of thing, I couldn't agree more. So thanks to the audience, thanks to the donors to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. They are very generous. They have been very generous over the 20 or so years the center has been in operation, and they make possible everything we do. So thank you. But most of all, thank you to our speaker for tonight, Dr. Yarbrough, for giving us such a wonderful talk, answering the questions as well. We really appreciate the conversation and the time you took. Everyone, I think, is going to be interested to rush out, or at least go to the website of their choice and purchase your book, Choctaw Confederates, and I think you'll enjoy it. As you know, we've intimated in the Q&A session, there's lots more in the book than you've heard about even tonight, so it's definitely worth going out and getting it. And finally, I hope that I see many of you again, or see in quotation marks in this format, at future Virginia Center for Civil War Studies events. I'm working on the schedule for the spring semester right now. So if you keep up with the website, or if you clicked yes in response to the question about whether you would be willing to be emailed by us on occasion, then you will get an email about the spring events. And again, as I said before, you can look at Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it and easily find out what's going on next spring and beyond. So thanks again, Dr. Yarbrough. Thanks to the audience, and have a good night.
Thank you.